Hello everybody, welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper reading. Today we shall be analyzing the Hindu newspaper dated 24th of June 2019 of the New Delhi edition. The topics to be discussed today has been presented on your screen. Timestamping for the same has been provided in the description box below. Let us begin our today's discussion. Now the first article appears as a lead article on page number 10. The title of the article is Reimagining the Niti Aayog. This article shall be important from the perspective of GS Paper 2 Governance under the subsection Issues and Challenges pertaining to the federal structure as well as devolution of powers and finances up to the local levels and challenges therein. Apart from that, this particular article also becomes important because if one looks at the previous year UPSC mains questions, two major dominant themes in the UPSC mains have been on the federal structure of the Indian Constitution as well as the empowerment of the Panchayati Raj institutions. It is in this particular regard the article which we are going to discuss becomes extremely important. Article 1 of the Indian Constitution states that India, that is Bharat, shall be a union of states. Even though we have preferred the term union of states over the term the federation of states, the Indian Constitution provides for a federalism in India. Federalism here basically pertains to the distribution of powers between the center and the states. Now, such kind of federalism can be seen in the 7th schedule of the Indian Constitution that provides for the distribution of powers between the center and states in the form of the union list, state list, and the concurrent list. And as you all must be aware, for the subjects placed under the union list, only the Parliament of India has the exclusive power to make laws. Similarly, for the subjects placed under the state list, the concerned state legislature has the power to make laws. However, for the subjects placed under the concurrent list, both the parliament as well as the state legislature have the power to make laws. However, in case of any conflict on a law made under the concurrent list, it is a law of the union that shall prevail upon the law of the state legislature. So, since the Indian Constitution provides for a clear-cut distribution of the roles and responsibilities between the central and the state government, it can be stated that the Indian Constitution seeks to set up a federal structure in India. Apart from that, the founding fathers of the Indian Constitution provided for a federal structure with a centralizing tendency. That is, the federal structure adopted in India gives more power to the central government as compared to the states. And such kind of federal structure was actually adopted in order to maintain the unity and integrity of India immediately after its independence. Now, one important aspect of the federal structure in India is the fiscal federalism. Now, fiscal federalism here basically pertains to the distribution of finances between the central government and the state government. Now, this particular article here has been written by a leading Indian economist, Mr. Vijay Kelkar. And Mr. Kelkar has highlighted certain gaps in the fiscal federalism architecture in India, wherein he has highlighted that this particular gap in the fiscal federalism has arisen on account of replacing the Planning Commission with the Niti Aayog. And accordingly, in his article, he has highlighted the need to strengthen the architecture of the fiscal federalism in India. In his article, Mr. Kelkar has focused on the 4 pillars of fiscal federalism. And these 4 pillars are the Finance Commission, the Niti Aayog 2.0, greater devolution of finances to the Panchayati Raj institutions and urban local bodies, and bringing about certain reforms with respect to the GST. Hence, as part of this video analysis, first and foremost we'll understand the concept of the fiscal federalism, and then we'll understand certain recommendations given in this particular article with respect to strengthening of these 4 pillars of the fiscal federalism. Apart from that, at the end of our video discussion, you should be able to attempt these 3 main questions for the practice. Let us start our analysis with the understanding of the fiscal federalism in India. In this particular video analysis, the different dimensions which we would be covering here include the concept of fiscal federalism, the need for Finance Commission, the role of Finance Commission in the fiscal federalism, and the recent debate related to the Finance Commission. As stated before, the fiscal federalism here basically pertains to the distribution of finances among the different levels of the government. Hence, the fiscal federalism provides for an economic framework for the working of federalism in India. And this particular fiscal federalism has mainly two important facets. The first facet of the fiscal federalism is assignment of functions to different levels of the government based upon the principle of subsidiary. The principle of subsidiary states that the functions should be allocated to that particular level of the government where the function can be performed in the most efficient manner. And such a principle of subsidiary has been adopted for the allocation of powers under the 7th schedule of the Indian Constitution. For example, defense as such can be performed efficiently only by the central government, and that is why the defense as a function has been allocated to the central government. On the other hand, the public order as a function can be performed efficiently by the state government, and accordingly, the public order has been assigned to the state government. So, the 7th schedule of the Indian Constitution provides for the allocation of roles and responsibilities to the central government and the state government based upon this principle of subsidiary. The second facet of fiscal federalism is the assignment of financial powers to the different levels of government in order to fulfill their roles and responsibilities. This particular assignment of financial powers can be seen in the fact that the income tax as such has been allocated to the central government in India. On the other hand, the property tax has been allocated to the state governments. Thus, the fiscal federalism provides for the clear-cut allocation of roles, responsibilities and finances between the central government and the state government. If you look at the assignment of roles and responsibilities and the financial powers to the state governments in India, it can be observed that the state governments have been assigned with a greater amount of roles and responsibilities. However, they have not been given sufficient amount of financial powers in order to fulfill their roles and responsibilities. On the other hand, the central government has been given much higher amount of financial powers as compared to its roles and responsibilities. So what can be stated here is that even though the roles and responsibilities of state government is much higher, the amount of financial powers which have been given to them is quite less. So this particular facet of fiscal federalism in India leads to what we call as the vertical imbalances in the finances between the states and the center. This is because the taxation powers given to the state government are not commensurate with the roles and responsibilities. On similar lines, if one looks at the different states in India, these different states are at different levels of development. Now, for example, some of the well-developed states such as Gujarat, Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, etc., they have much greater finances in order to provide the basic goods and services. However, the same cannot be said about the poorer states in India. So, this particular differences in the individual capacity of the states to provide for the different goods and services leads to the horizontal imbalances in the finances among the different states in India. So, in order to address this vertical imbalances in finances between the center and states, as well as to address the horizontal imbalances in the finances among the different states in India, we need to set up the Finance Commission. So, what exactly the Finance Commission does? The Finance Commission provides for the transfer of finances from the central government to the state government, and this we call as the vertical distribution of taxes. This is called as vertical distribution because here the finances are transferred from the central government to the state government. And secondly, the Finance Commission provides for the distribution of states' share of taxes among the different states in India. And this can be referred to as the horizontal distribution of taxes among the different states. So the Finance Commission is required to be set up in order to address the vertical and the horizontal imbalances between the central government and the state government. Further, you need to note that the Finance Commission is a constitutional body which is created under Article 280 of the Indian Constitution, wherein Article 280 provides that the Finance Commission shall be set up by the President every 5 years or earlier. And as stated before, the main role of the Finance Commission is to give recommendations to the Parliament with respect to transfer of finances from the centre to the states and among the different states in India. So once the Finance Commission gives recommendations, its recommendations will be applicable for a period of 5 years. Presently, we are following the recommendations of the 14th Finance Commission, and its recommendations are applicable from the year 2015 to 2020. And from the financial year 2021 onwards, we would be following the recommendations of the 15th Finance Commission. If you look at the recent trends in the vertical distribution of taxes between the center and the states, the 12th Finance Commission had recommended that the central government should transfer 30.5% of its taxes to the state governments. Now, this particular share of the central taxes to be transferred to state governments was increased according to the recommendations of the 13th Finance Commission, which recommended that the central government should transfer at least 32% of its taxes. And presently, according to the 14th Finance Commission recommendations, the central government is transferring 42% of its taxes to the various states in India. So from the year 2015 onwards, the central government is transferring almost 42% of its taxes to the states. Secondly, as stated before, different states in India are at different levels of development, and accordingly, this 42% of the state's share cannot be shared equitably among all the states in India. What is needed here is that the well-developed states should get less percentage of this particular share, whereas the poorer states should get a much higher share of this particular 42% of the central taxes. So accordingly, the 14th Finance Commission has adopted a criteria for this horizontal distribution of taxes among the different states in India. And some of these criteria here include the area of a state, the population of a state according to the 1971 census, the demographic change wherein we are taking into account the population of a state according to 2011 census, the area of a state under the forest, as well as the income distance. The income distance here basically pertains to the difference in the per capita income of a state with the per capita income of the richest state in India. So the income distance is higher, then the particular state will be getting much higher amount of finances. On the other hand, if the income distance is lower, a particular state would be getting a less amount of share from the central government. Further, it is to be noted that among all these criteria, the highest weightage has been given to the income distance by the 14th Finance Commission. Having understood the role of Finance Commission in the fiscal federalism architecture, let us now understand the recent debate about the Finance Commission. Now, this particular recent debate of the Finance Commission is with respect to whether to give the permanent status to the Finance Commission. Now, as stated before, the Finance Commission is set up by the President every 5 years or earlier. So, once the Finance Commission gives its recommendations, the Finance Commission is automatically dissolved. Which means to say, presently the Finance Commission in India is not a permanent body. In this regard, the RBI Governor Mr. Shaktikanta Das has recently argued for giving permanent status to the Finance Commission. Now, his argument was based upon a rationale that different finance commissions have adopted different approaches with respect to tax devolution as well as the criteria for the horizontal distribution of the taxes. Now, as stated before, the 12th Finance Commission had recommended for the transfer of 30.5% of the central taxes to the state government. This was increased by the 13th Finance Commission to 32%, and now we are transferring almost 42% of the central taxes to the state government. So over a period of time, there has been drastic increase in the tax devolution. Apart from that, there has been difference in the criteria adopted for the horizontal distribution of the taxes among the different states. Now, for example, the earlier 13th Finance Commission had adopted the criteria of the fiscal discipline. Now, as part of this fiscal discipline, we used to look at the parameters such as the revenue deficit and the fiscal deficit in order to provide for the transfer of the taxes from the central government to the state government. However, the 14th Finance Commission has done away with this particular concept of the fiscal discipline. So, different finance commissions have used different approaches for the vertical and horizontal distribution of taxes, because of which Mr. Shaktikanta Das has argued that there is lack of consistency in the transfer of funds from the central government to the state government, and this particular problem can be solved by giving a permanent status to the Finance Commission. So by granting permanent status to the Finance Commission, there would be a greater amount of certainty and stability with respect to the transfer of finances from the central government to the state government. However, this particular argument of RBI governor has been opposed by Mr. Kelkar, wherein Mr. Kelkar has argued that the present mechanism of setting up finance commission every 5 years is working perfectly fine, and hence there is no need to grant the permanent status to the finance commission. Apart from this, Mr. Kelkar has also argued that by replacing the planning commission with the Niti Aayog, a gap has been created in the fiscal federalism architecture of India, and accordingly, Mr. Kelkar is of the opinion that the Niti Aayog has to be suitably strengthened. In this regard, let us understand the viewpoint of Mr. Kelkar with respect to strengthening of the Niti Aayog. When the NDA government took over in the year 2014, one of the major reforms of the NDA government was to replace the erstwhile Planning Commission with the Niti Aayog. Now, one major difference between the Planning Commission and the Niti Aayog is that, unlike the Planning Commission, the Niti Aayog does not have power to transfer finances from the central government to the state government. So, before the setting up of Niti Aayog, if you look at the transfer of finances from the central government to the state government, it used to take place through mainly two routes. Transfer of finances based upon the recommendations of the Finance Commission, as we have discussed before, and the second route was transfer of finances based upon the recommendations of Planning Commission. And in order to provide for the transfer of finances from the central government to the state government, the Planning Commission had adopted the Gadgil-Mukherjee formula. Now, this particular Gadgil-Mukherjee formula is almost similar to the criteria adopted by the Finance Commission for the horizontal distribution of taxes among the different states in India, wherein, according to the Gadgil-Mukherjee formula, the Planning Commission used to transfer a higher amount of finances to the poorer states and less amount of finances to the already well-developed states. So, by transferring the finances from the central government to the state government based upon the recommendations of the Planning Commission, we were able to reduce the income inequality among the states in India, because of which the poorer states in India were able to grow at a much higher pace as compared to the richer states, and this led to a conditional convergence. In other words, the poorer states were able to catch up with the richer states on account of the recommendations of the Planning Commission. In this regard, Mr. Kelkar has suggested that after the setting up of Niti Aayog, the entire structure of fiscal federalism is resting on only one pillar, that is the Finance Commission. And this second pillar of fiscal federalism has been done away with because of the setting up of Niti Aayog. Apart from that, as stated before, because of the recommendations of the Planning Commission, we were able to ensure that the poorer states are growing at a much higher pace than the richer states, and this led to the conditional convergence. But now, since Niti Aayog does not provide for transfer of finances from the central government to the states, this form of conditional convergence may not be possible in future. So, after identifying these issues in the fiscal federalism architecture in India, Mr. Kelkar has given certain recommendations, wherein the first recommendation of Mr. Kelkar is to empower the Niti Aayog to transfer the finances from the central government to the states. This, he believes that it would lead to the conditional convergence which was earlier taking place under the Planning Commission. And he has also highlighted that the Niti Aayog should be able to transfer at least 1 to 2% of India's GDP from the central government to the state government. Secondly, he has also highlighted that the Niti Aayog should be involved in important economic decision makings in India. For example, he has suggested that the vice chairman of Niti Aayog should become part of the Cabinet Committee on Economic Affairs, which is entrusted with the important responsibility of making the economic decisions in India. And lastly, in order to ensure that the state governments in India are efficiently utilizing the transfer of funds from the central government, Mr. Kelkar has suggested that there is a need to have an independent evaluation office under the Niti Aayog, and this particular office should be entrusted with the responsibility of monitoring and evaluating the efficiency of grants given by the central government to the states. Overall, the idea of Mr. Kelkar is that the Niti Aayog should become 2.0, that is, it should be a second version of Niti Aayog, and it should be given sufficient amount of powers to transfer the finances from the central government to the state government. Now coming to the third pillar of the fiscal federalism, that is the finances of the local bodies in India. As you all must be aware, the 73rd and 74th Constitutional Amendment Act led to the creation of the Panchayati Raj institutions as well as the urban local bodies in India. In this regard, Article 243G under the 73rd Constitutional Amendment Act provides that the state governments may transfer 29 functional items to the Panchayati Raj institutions. On similar lines, Article 243W of the 74th Constitutional Amendment Act provides that the state governments may transfer 18 functional items to the urban local bodies. So the 73rd and 74th Amendment Act provides that the state governments may transfer some of their roles and responsibilities to the local bodies in India. And in order to fulfill their roles and responsibilities, both these two Constitutional Amendment Act provides that the state governments may transfer their powers of taxation to the local bodies. So in this regard, if you look at some of the states such as Kerala and Karnataka, these states have transferred the power of imposition of the property taxes as well as the professional tax to the local bodies. However, most of the states have failed to provide enough financial powers to the local bodies in order to fulfill their constitutionally mandated roles and responsibilities. So, in order to address this particular problem, Mr. Kelkar has suggested that we need to create a consolidated fund for the local bodies in India. And this particular consolidated fund would be on lines similar to the Consolidated Fund of India as well as the Consolidated Fund of the state. So in other words, there is a need to have a dedicated fund for the local bodies. And in order to ensure that the local bodies have sufficient amount of money in their consolidated fund, Mr. Kelkar has suggested that both the central government as well as the state government should transfer at least 1/6 of their central GST as well as the state GST to the consolidated fund of the local bodies. This, he believes, would lead to a transfer of funds equivalent to 1% of India's GDP from the central government and the state government to the local bodies. Apart from that, the second ARC report on the local governance has highlighted that in order to bring about a genuine democratic decentralization, we need to focus on the transfer of 3 Fs, that is, the transfer of funds, functions and functionaries to the local bodies. So this particular transfer of funds through the setting up of the consolidated fund has to be matched by the transfer of functions as well as the transfer of functionaries to the local bodies. Now coming to the fourth pillar of the fiscal federalism, that is the GST. The article has highlighted that the GST was introduced in order to simplify the taxation regime of the indirect taxes. However, over a period of time, the GST Council has introduced a number of GST rates, and this has in turn led to the complications with respect to the implementation of the GST regime. In this regard, the article has highlighted that we need to move towards a single rate GST. So by moving towards a single rate GST, we would be able to simplify the taxation regime in India. Apart from that, the article has highlighted that the single rate GST should be accompanied by higher taxes on the luxury goods. In other words, what this article is highlighting is that on most of the goods and services in India, we need to have a single GST rate. However, on those goods and services which are considered as the luxury goods, on such goods and services, we can impose a higher GST rates. And lastly, the article has highlighted that in order to improve the expertise of the GST Council, there is a need to set up an independent secretariat which shall be vested with the responsibility of providing all the necessary policy inputs to the GST Council. So these are some of the important aspects which one must know with respect to this particular article. Further, based upon a video analysis, you should be able to write answers to these 3 main questions for practice. With this, let us now take up the next article. Now the next article appears on page number 15. Now this particular article here highlights the recent trends in the GST collection. Apart from that, this article has also given certain recommendations in order to improve the GST collection in India. Hence, this article becomes important mainly from the perspective of prelims under the subsection Indian economy. Now, in order to understand this particular article, you would be required to understand two basic economic concepts, that is, the tax buoyancy and the tax elasticity. Now, the total amount of tax collected by the government would in turn depend on mainly two factors. The first factor being the GDP growth rate and the second factor being the tax rates. Now, with respect to the first factor, as the GDP increases, the tax collection of the government also increases. On similar lines, as the tax rates increases, usually the tax collection of the government also increases. So, in order to measure to what extent the tax collected by the government of India changes in response to the GDP growth rate as well as the tax rates, we have the concept of the tax buoyancy and the tax elasticity. So, if you look at the tax buoyancy essentially refers to the changes in the tax collection of the government with respect to the changes in the GDP growth, wherein tax buoyancy is calculated as the percentage change in the tax revenue divided by the percentage change in the GDP into 100. So if you look at this particular formula, if the tax buoyancy is greater than 1, this would essentially means that the government tax revenues have increased by much higher value as compared to the GDP growth. Now for example, if the GDP has increased by 6%, but the tax revenue have increased by around 10%, it would mean that the tax revenue have increased by a much higher value as compared to the GDP growth rate, because of which the tax buoyancy would be greater than 1. On the other hand, in response to the GDP growth rate of 6%, if the tax revenue have increased only by 5%, it would mean that the tax buoyancy is less than 1. In other words, the tax revenue of the government has increased by a much lower pace in response to the GDP growth rate. On similar lines, if tax buoyancy is equal to 1, it would mean that 6% growth in the GDP has translated into 6% change in the tax revenue. But the question here is, what could be the possible reasons for the tax buoyancy? First and foremost, due to the increase in the GDP, there would be increase in the tax base. Now, for example, the higher GDP growth rate could translate into higher income levels of the individuals, because of which more number of individuals may move into higher tax brackets, leading to the increase in the tax collection of the government. Another possible reason for the tax buoyancy could be more profits of the companies due to the higher GDP growth rate. Now, this can be understood by looking at this particular example. Let's say the corporate tax rate has remained unchanged at 30%. So, in the year 2017-18, the company A earned a profits of rupees 100 and accordingly paid rupees 30 as a corporate tax. However, in the year 2018-19, the profits of the company A has now increased to rupees 200 due to the higher GDP growth rate, and accordingly it would be required to pay 30% of rupees 200 as the corporate tax, and this translates into rupees 60. So you can see clearly here that there has been increase in the tax collection of the government, and such an increase in the tax collection is not on account of the increase in the tax rate, rather it has been on account of the increase in the profits of the company A. Now this particular aspect is referred to as the tax buoyancy. On the other hand, if you look at the tax elasticity, as stated before, the tax collection of the government increases or decreases with respect to the changes in the tax rates, and accordingly the tax elasticity here refers to the changes in the tax collection of the government in response to the changes in the tax rates. Now, for example, in the year 2017-18, let's say the corporate tax rate was 25%. On the other hand, in the year 2018-19, the corporate tax rate was 30%. So, because of this increase in the tax rate, the tax collection of the government has also increased accordingly. So, this particular increase in the tax collection of the government on account of the increase in the tax rate would be referred to as the tax elasticity. In order to summarize this particular discussion, you need to note that the changes in the tax collection in response to changes in the GDP growth is referred to as the tax buoyancy, whereas the changes in the tax collection in response to tax rates is referred to as the tax elasticity. Let us understand the important highlights of this particular article. Now, this particular article here highlights that at the start of every financial year, the Government of India sets ambitious targets with respect to GST collection in India. However, it has been observed that most of the time the government fails to meet these ambitious targets of the GST collection. So, because of this particular failure of the government to meet these targets, some of the economists in India have argued that the GST has not been very successful. Now, this particular article here highlights that it is wrong to measure the performance of the GST with the ambitious targets set by the government. Rather, we need to measure the performance of the GST in response to the changes in the nominal GDP growth. That is, in other words, we need to measure the performance of GST in terms of the tax buoyancy. So, with respect to performance of GST with respect to tax buoyancy, if one looks at the tax buoyancy in India, before the introduction of GST, the tax buoyancy was actually less than 1. In other words, the tax buoyancy for number of taxes such as the state value added taxes or the central indirect taxes, the tax buoyancy was less than 1. However, after the introduction of GST, the tax buoyancy has now increased to 1.2, which means to say the tax revenue from the GST have increased by much higher value as compared to the nominal GDP growth rate. Now, one possible reason for this increase in the tax buoyancy of the GST is on account of the input tax credit given to the firms. Now, this article has highlighted that since the firms are allowed to avail the input tax credit, it has incentivized the firms to get enrolled under the GST, and this has led to the increase in the tax base, and consequently the tax collection of the government has also increased, leading to the tax buoyancy. And lastly, the article has argued that the tax buoyancy has to be increased to more than 1.2, and this can be done by taking a number of steps. First and foremost, the article has highlighted that there is a need to bring the petroleum goods under the ambit of the GST. Secondly, it has highlighted that a large number of small size firms are unable to file the GST returns due to the higher compliance burden, and accordingly, the government has to reduce the compliance burden on these small size firms in order to improve the tax base. And lastly, in order to avoid the tax evasion, there is a need for greater coordination among the various investigative agencies. So these are some of the important aspects which one must know with respect to this particular article. With this, let us now take up the next article. Now the next article appears on page number 9. Now this particular article appears in the form of an image and talks about the Ambubachi Mela, which is presently celebrated at the historic Kamakhya temple located in the state of Assam. Hence, this article becomes important mainly from the perspective of prelims under the subsection Cultural History of India. Apart from this, this article is also important because in previous year UPSC prelims, questions have been asked with respect to the temple architecture as well as the cultural history of India. The Ambubachi Mela is considered to be one of the most important festival associated with the Kamakhya temple located in the state of Assam. Now this particular Mela is celebrated every year, particularly during the monsoon in the month of June. The one important significance of the Ambubachi Mela is that during this particular Mela, it is believed that the presiding goddess, that is Devi Kamakhya, goes through the annual cycle of the menstruation. And because of such a belief, the doors of the Kamakhya temple are closed for a period of 3 days. One of the main beliefs and cultural tradition in Hinduism is the worship of goddess. In this regard, the Shakti Pitas are referred to the places of worship or the temples which are dedicated to the goddess. So if one looks at the Kamakhya temple is considered to be one of the oldest Shakti Pitas in India. The Kamakhya temple was built around the 8th century, and since then it has undergone renovations a large number of times. So because of such renovations over a period of time, the Kamakhya temple has come to acquire a unique and indigenous type of temple architecture referred to as the Nilachal type of architecture. Now one unique aspect related to this particular temple architecture is that it has been built on a cruciform base. Now cruciform base here refers to the plus shaped base, and this is almost similar to that of the Christian cross. And on this cruciform base, a hemispherical dome has been built as shown in this particular image. So having understood about the Ambubachi Mela as well as the Kamakhya temple, let us now solve the previous year prelims questions. Now this was a question which was asked in the prelims 2012. The question was the Nagara, Dravida and Vesara are. It is to be noted that the Nagara, Dravida and Vesara are associated with the temple architecture, wherein the Nagara style of architecture is predominantly found in the northern part of India. The Dravida form of architecture is predominantly found in the southern part of India, whereas Vesara type of architecture is predominantly found in the central Indian region as well as the Deccan Plateau. More importantly, the Vesara temple architecture is associated with the Chalukyan style of the temple construction. So the answer to this particular question is C. Now coming to the second question which was asked in the prelims 2014, the question here is with reference to cultural history of India, the Panchayatan refers to. Now the Panchayatan is a unique type of temple architecture wherein the main shrine is placed in the middle, and this particular main shrine is in turn surrounded by 4 subsidiary shrines placed in the corners, and such kind of temple architecture can be observed at the Dasha Avatar Vishnu temple located in UP. So the answer to this particular question is C. With this, let us now take up the next article. Now the next article appears on page number 11. Now this particular article appears in the form of the data point, and it highlights the progress of India with respect to reduction of the infant mortality rate. Now this particular article becomes important mainly from the perspective of prelims under the subsection social development. Now if you look at the concept of the infant mortality rate, the IMR refers to the number of deaths of the children per 1000 live births before they attain the age of 1. So if the IMR rate is 30, it would mean that out of 1000 live births, 30 children have died before they attain the age of 1. So this particular article here highlights that in the year 1997, the infant mortality rate in India was around 71. However, in the year 2017, the IMR has now got reduced to around 33. Now one of the related concept of the IMR is the neonatal mortality rate. Now the neonatal mortality rate here refers to the number of deaths of the children per 1000 live births before they attain the age of 28 days. On similar lines, the maternal mortality rate refers to the number of maternal deaths per 1 lakh births. So the IMR is calculated in terms of per 1000 live births of the children, whereas MMR is calculated in terms of per 1 lakh births. And with respect to maternal mortality rate, in the year 2011, the MMR in India was around 167. However, in the year 2017, it has now got reduced to around 130. Now this particular article here highlights various trends with respect to the reduction in the infant mortality rate across different states in India. However, the data which is presented here is not that important. What is important here is the various government schemes and programs for reducing the infant mortality rate. Hence, as part of this video analysis, let us understand some important government initiatives. The first and foremost initiative of the government is the Janani Suraksha Yojana. Now this particular scheme has been launched by the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare in order to promote the institutional deliveries in the government hospitals as well as the private hospitals. So under the Janani Suraksha Yojana, eligible pregnant women, that is the pregnant women belonging to BPL section as well as the scheduled caste and scheduled tribe, are given cash assistance of ₹1000. And this particular cash assistance is given irrespective of the age of mother as well as the number of children. The second initiative of the government is Janani Shishu Suraksha Yojana. This particular program has been once again launched by the government in order to promote the institutional deliveries in the government hospitals. Under this particular program, all the pregnant women who deliver in the government hospitals are entitled to get free drugs, free diagnostics, as well as they are entitled to free transport from their homes to the hospitals. The next program is Mission Indradhanush, which is basically a universal immunization program which seeks to provide life-saving vaccines to all the children across the country. The next initiative is known as MA, which stands for Mother's Absolute Affection. This particular scheme has been launched by Ministry of Health and Family Welfare in order to promote breastfeeding practices among the lactating mothers. The next scheme is Vatsalya Matri Amrit Kosh, which has been launched by Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, and the main objective of this particular scheme is to create a human milk bank in order to support the breastfeeding among the infants. The next scheme is Integrated Child Development Scheme, which is under the Ministry of Women and Child Development, and among the different components of this ICDS scheme, one main component is to improve the health and nutrition status of the children in the age group 0 to 6 years. The next important scheme is a maternity benefit scheme known as Pradhan Mantri Matru Vandana Yojana, which is launched by the Ministry of Women and Child Development, wherein this particular scheme seeks to provide a cash assistance of up to Rs 5,000 to the eligible pregnant and lactating mothers. And lastly, Poshan Abhiyan, which is a scheme launched by the Ministry of Women and Child Development, seeks to have a convergence of government schemes and programs in order to improve the nutrition status of the children. So these are some of the important aspects which one must know with respect to this particular article. Now the next article appears on page number 8. Now this particular article highlights that the scientists have recently decoded the genome of a miracle plant known as the Arogyapacha. Hence, this article becomes important mainly from the perspective of prelims under the subsection General Science. Apart from that, this article is also important because if one looks at the previous year UPSC prelims questions have been asked with respect to important plant species. As part of this video analysis, let us understand some important facets of the miracle plant known as the Arogyapacha. Arogyapacha is actually a medicinal plant which is endemic to the Agastyamalai Hills. This medicinal plant is traditionally used by the Kani tribes who live in this particular region. Now, this particular plant is considered to be a miracle plant because it can be used to treat a number of diseases as well as to improve the health condition of the people. For example, this particular medicinal plant can be used as the antioxidant. Apart from that, this medicinal plant can be used to treat the infections related to the microbes as well as the inflammatory infections. And some of the studies have proved that this medicinal plant can also be used to treat the diabetes. So this particular article has highlighted that the scientists in Kerala have recently carried out the genome sequencing of Arogyapacha. Now genome sequencing actually refers to the sequencing of an organism's chromosomal DNA as well as the DNA contained in mitochondria. So by undertaking the genome sequencing, we would be able to understand the molecular secrets associated with this particular medicinal plant, and in future we would be able to develop the personalized medicines in order to treat various health conditions. So having understood certain basic details of Arogyapacha, let us now solve the previous year prelims questions. The question here is, the government of India encourages the cultivation of Seabuk thorn. What is the importance of this particular plant? It is to be noted that the Seabuk thorn is mainly found in the high altitude areas of the Indian Himalayan region. Apart from that, this particular species has proven potential in environmental conservation as well as the health benefits. For example, this particular species of the plant can be used for controlling soil erosion. So if you look at the options which are given here, both option number 1 and 3 are correct. And accordingly, the answer to this particular question is C. Now coming to the second question which was asked in the prelims 2019, the question was, there was growing awareness in our country about the importance of the Himalayan nettle because it is found to be a sustainable source of. The answer to this particular question is textile fiber. So these are some of the important aspects which one must know with respect to this particular article. Based upon our video analysis, these 4 questions shall be a prelims question for the practice. Please pause this video and try to find answers to these 4 questions. We shall be discussing the answer after 5 seconds. The first question here is, which among the following criteria are adopted by the 14th Finance Commission for the horizontal distribution of taxes among the states? So if you look at the options here, except fiscal discipline, all other criteria are adopted by the 14th Finance Commission for the horizontal distribution of taxes. Hence, accordingly, the correct answer to this particular question is C. Now coming to the second question, the question here is, which among the following factors can possibly contribute to the increase in the tax buoyancy? The first option here is increase in the disposable income of the individuals. Now this particular option here, as we have discussed, is correct. The second option reads as changes in the tax rate. Now this option here is wrong. The third option reads as increase in the GST compliance by the MSMEs. This particular option here is correct because the increase in the GST compliance would lead to the increase in the tax base. The fourth option reads as bringing the petroleum goods under the GST. Even this option here is correct. So if you look at the options which are given here, the correct answer to this particular question is C. Now coming to the third question, the question here is consider the following statements related to the Kamakhya temple. The first statement here is it is one of the oldest Shakti Peethas located in the state of Assam. As we have discussed, this statement here is correct. The second statement reads as it is modeled along the Vesara type of temple architecture found in the North India. Now this option here is wrong. This is because the Kamakhya temple is modeled along the Neelanchal type of architecture, which is quite unique and indigenous to this particular temple. Hence the correct answer to this particular question is A. Now coming to the last question, the question here is consider the following statements related to the Mother's Affection Program, which is also referred to as MA. The first option here is it is launched by the Ministry of Women and Child Development. This option here is wrong. This is because the MA program is launched by the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. The second option reads as the objective of this program is to provide cash assistance to the pregnant and lactating mothers. Even this option here is wrong. This is because the main objective of this particular program is to promote safe breastfeeding practices among the lactating mothers. Hence the correct answer to this particular question is D. That is neither 1 nor 2. With this, we have come to end of today's discussion. Now let us have a look at the question for the day.